Hey there, beautiful, and welcome back to the Boundaries Unleashed podcast. Whether you're brand new to the podcast or have been listening to me since season one, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Today's episode is a reintroduction of sorts, kind of like a let's catch up over coffee and real talk kind of moment, because truthfully, so much has changed since season one when I recorded my story so far, in which I shared my backstory and how I became a boundaries coach. I've changed and my life has shifted in big, beautiful ways and sometimes messy, sometimes meaningful. And you deserve to know the full truth, not just the coach behind the mic, but the woman who's walking the path with you in real time. So grab your coffee, go for a walk, settle into your sacred space, whatever feels right for you at the moment, because I'm going to be pulling back the curtain and inviting you into my world. So let's do this. Now, how does my life look different? So let's start with the obvious. I live in Australia now. Full stop. I know I've mentioned that on a lot of episodes this season, but it is probably the biggest change since season one when I recorded that episode. In Australia, where kangaroos jump around and are abundant, just like deer are back home, and wearing a hat is not just a fashion trend, but required living here because the sun will literally melt your face off. So we moved from the United States on military orders. So we're here on a posting for my husband's job, my husband's active duty. And it was kind of a twilight tour. We're supposed to be a twilight tour. One of our last adventures before him retiring from decades of service. But what made this move really interesting was the timing. We were standing on the edge of several big transitions all at once. So I had taken my business fully online from my brick and mortar. My daughter was shifting from preschool to kindergarten, and my husband was preparing post-military life into the civilian world. And probably the biggest piece of all these shifts were we had just gotten through a lot of major health shifts concerns with our extended family. And so everyone was doing really well. And for the first time in a long time, it felt safe to leap. Now, leap we did. I remember coming home from dropping my daughter off at preschool, and my husband, fresh off a phone call, looked at me and said, "So, I've got something to ask you." Little did I know what question he was about to ask, but here's what I didn't fully realize in that exciting rush of, yes, of course we'll move to Australia, was that every big yes comes with a string of no's. Yes to a new life, no to what we knew. Yes to adventure, no to familiarity. Yes to growth, no to comfort, at least at first. And that's the bittersweet reality of aligned decision making. It's not always pain free. Even when it feels right, it can still hurt. But with any leap, the ripple effects show up in unexpected places. And for us, one of the hardest parts of this move wasn't the logistics, it was the heartbreak. Because that became very real for us when we had to rehome our dogs. The sting and the pain of that decision of hearing, no, sorry, we can't take her throughout that whole journey, it was just purely heartbreaking. We had two dogs, Chloe, who was a lab pit mix, and Chauncey, a bulldog. We had them for 10 years. We had the Chloe since a puppy and Chauncey pretty much when he was a young puppy. He was 1 year old. And, they were family. They had made moves with us. They were there before our daughter was born. They were there through her birth and her early toddler years. But there's a breed ban in Australia. And between the breed ban, the cost of international transport, I don't know if you've ever looked into those fees, but it's hella expensive. And just the trauma of it all would have caused for them to fly, especially my lab pick mix, who just extremely nervous dog. And so she would have been heavily sedated. And it's a long flight for humans, twice as long for an animal who has to be in certain areas of, the plane. And it's not good. It felt inhumane to make her go through that. So them coming with us just wasn't aligned. It didn't make sense. And we had just lost one of them, our bulldog we had to put down shortly before we left for health reasons. So it didn't make sense. It wasn't aligned, and it was heartbreaking. It still is heartbreaking. And rehoming was very painful. We're still full of a lot of guilt about having to rehome the dog that we've had for 10 years. She was a rescue dog with very specific needs, and letting go of her presence in our everyday lives, like, it was one of the hardest things we've ever done. Suddenly there were no 3 a.m. wake ups or morning pee cleanups. There was no bark filled interruptions on coaching calls. And if you've ever done one of my challenges, you know that they were a permanent presence on those. There was no soulful snores or loud snores during my tarot pull. There was no more walks where we could clear the head and just experience nature together. And I miss them with my whole heart, both of them. One has passed. I still do. Like, it is still probably the one regret that I have about this move. One of the things that surprised me about that decision, in their absence, I noticed something, and it was my nervous system finally felt like it could exhale. And I know that sounds weird, but let me explain. There were parts of my body that, and spirit, honestly, that had been clenched in ways I didn't realize until the barking stopped, until the quiet came. And having 2 high maintenance dogs and rescue dogs, and you never realize how much you accommodate your life, or you change your behaviors in your everyday life to accommodate those needs. And you don't really realize it until the day you don't have to do it anymore. And you wake up on the other side like, is this what it's like? And my nervous system didn't realize how big of a deal that was, because you do anything for your family. And when we didn't have to do all those accommodations, it really affected me. My nervous system jumped down about 10 paces. And like I said, this is probably the only real regret I have about our move. But even then, I just know, and I just knew then, and I know now, that this was all part of our soul contract, that part of this was fated, and this was all unfolding and already in motion. And when you're walking an aligned path, sometimes the decisions you make, the decisions that stretch you, are also the ones that shape you. And dogs weren't the only change. Let's talk about cultural shifts. So Australia's vibe, and I've talked about this before, is more UK influenced than American, which I kind of knew, but whenever I tell people I was moving to Australia, everyone's like, "Oh, it's very Americanized. They watch a lot of American, like, culture, TV, movies. They're much more laid back than England and Scotland, like everyone in the UK." So I was like, okay, but there's subtle shifts, but they are definitely different, and not so subtle sometimes, from the way people greet you, to the way time and space is held, to what is considered polite or too much. Yeah, it's very, very, very different. It's been a blessing to experience those differences, and kind of a wake-up call. And everything about it had me really opening my eyes to how I related to life, how I related to space, to the pace of life, to work, to motherhood, to my relationship with my husband, and to myself. And speaking of motherhood, you know, my daughter now goes to an all-girls private school here, and it is like the craziest thing. Never would I ever think that that was going to happen in my life, because she straight up looks like a little, like, Madeline, with the blazer and the straw hat and the plaid dress. And she's even sorted into like a school house with its own colors and mascot, like straight out of Harry Potter. Like, I kid you not. And it's like, I never could have pictured that, especially as, my husband and I, we both grew up public school system. I was on the free lunch program. And so it was just, it's a very different shift and energy that my daughter gets to experience in this part of her school life anyway. And so even with that shift, the first day of school, forming new relationship for her and for me. It's just been a wild ride of releasing old expectations and adjusting my boundaries and really my mindset with grace and knowing that just to be open to everything. Different is to be expected and different can be good. And even if it doesn't align with me, I can learn from it. And so with that, I've had to unlearn, relearn, and practice my presence, not just as a coach or a business owner, but as a woman, as a mother, as a spouse, navigating a new map of what it means to belong. Now, not only has it affected my day to day and how we show up, but it's also really affected my spiritual side. And through all of these changes, the big moves, cultural shifts, parenting shifts, grieving my dogs, something anchored me. And my spiritual practices didn't just keep me afloat. I would say they reminded me who I am. These days, my tarot deck feels more like a lifeline than a tool. My crystals made the journey with me. My connection to spirit, to the unseen, to my own inner knowing has become more vital than ever before. And I often say I'm not just a boundaries coach, I'm a spiritual self-leadership coach. And it's because for recovering people pleasers like us, boundaries just aren't saying no or canceling plans you didn't want to make in the first place. It's about remembering who you are, recentering in your power, and saying yes to what deeply aligns with your soul. And through all these major pivots, my spiritual health really saved me. And I work with empaths and recovering people pleasers who crave clarity, who crave self-trust, who crave permission to become more of who they really are. And so whether it's through my Leap coaching program, my tarot-based Inner Magic membership, or even this very podcast, I want to help you live a life that doesn't betray your magic. Now, don't get me wrong, my spiritual tools are powerful, but they didn't make me immune to life's curveballs. And what they do help with, though, I will say, is they help you move through them and without losing yourself. And I think that's the biggest message here is to go through major transitions without losing yourself. And truthfully, right before our big move, life threw some of the biggest curveballs and hardest lessons I've ever had to walk through. There was so much loss, so much grief, and navigating it while holding my family, my clients, and myself, it really cracked me in ways I wasn't expecting. It really cracked me open. So I want to tell you a little bit of what that season looked like for me. Now, in the year leading up to our move, it felt like almost everything was being stripped away. And I know that sounds dramatic, but there was a lot going on in my life. We had lost family members, some unexpectedly, some after long journeys. It was kind of a season where grief becomes layered. The grief of who you lost, the grief of who you were before everything changed, and the quiet ache of knowing life will never be back to what it was. So there weren't just personal losses, they were soul rocking, like forever changing. And I was holding space for everyone else. And I was also asking myself during this time, who's holding space for me? And it was one of the hardest spiritual initiations I've ever been through. And yet something inside me still stayed lit. I held that tiny flame close as we made impossible decisions and packed up our life. Now, you might remember me saying earlier that I shared that my family had been through some heavy losses and some serious medical diagnoses. What I didn't fully express was just how much those really impacted me. And I know a lot of you can relate to this, but no one expects a cancer diagnosis, let alone 2, let alone 3. For years leading up to our move, probably about 3, so like the 3 years directly preceding our move, both of my parents took turns facing cancer. When one went into remission, the other one was diagnosed. And when they stabilized, the other relapsed. It was relentless, y'all. Like it was wild. I'm deeply grateful to say that both of them are doing well today, but the emotional toll of that time, it's still very much present. It has left its marks and it still very much affects my family to this day still. And the impact on it too hasn't really left our nervous systems. And if, dealing with that prior to a move wasn't enough, just 6 months before we boarded our one-way flight to start our new life abroad, I was hit with a wave of loss that honestly it felt like a free fall with no bottom. Like it was relentless. First, it started with a close friend and client who passed away from ALS complications. Just a few weeks after that, an old friend from high school took her own life. Not long after that, my grandmother passed away from a long stretch of declining health. And I was barely catching my breath from all of this when another call came. It was a late Sunday night, and it was my dad to tell me that my 16-year-old nephew had died in a car crash. It was a lot, like one after the other. It really felt like a free fall with no bottom. There were two family funerals back to back. One week apart, one for my nephew and then one for my delayed memorial of my grandmother who'd passed prior to. It was that time, it felt like I was moving through an out of body experience that wouldn't end. I like even just thinking about it now, like it was like I was in motion, but I wasn't tethered. I definitely wasn't grounded. It was a lot. Uh, and just when you think you can't take any more, one of your dogs all of a sudden has this massive decline in health, and now you're sending him off the rainbow bridge, and you're just like, "Hey, life, I'm good. Can you stop? Because she's done. She's done. Please stop." And this is all literally weeks before I got on a plane. And so I'm not sharing all this to be this like massive Debbie Downer. I promise. I know it's a lot to take in. Trust me, it was a lot to experience. It's a lot to receive it as a listener. So I appreciate you listening here. But I share it with you too because I want, if you're in the thick of it, if you're also in a season of like endless, bottomless free fall, I want you to know, even through all that, we can do hard shit. We can. We can melt into puddles and still make decisions. We can face death and still make life altering moves. We can grieve deeply and still not lose ourselves in the process. Our purpose, our sacred role in this life, it still pulses underneath it all. Even if we don't fully understand what it means until months or even years after the fact or down the road. And life isn't always fair. Honestly, that season of my life felt anything but fair, but there's still magic in it all. And it's taken a lot of work to say that, but there's still magic in it. It was still magic in it for me. It was also abundant, abundant in lessons, abundant in spiritual clarity, and in divine invitations to let go. Now, grief forced me to release what I thought I needed to hold on to. It cleared the way, if you will, so I could let go again and again in preparation for this biggest leap of my life of moving across the globe. I was going to have to say goodbye to a lot of things. And so, through those losses, the universe was giving me something back, a deeper connection to gratitude, a sense of urgency to stop waiting for the quote, quote, right time to do things. It was a reminder that this messy, beautiful, aching human life, this is the assignment. This is why we're here, to have that experience, to have that human experience, to live it, to feel it, to expand through it, to honor our soul's journey by actually being in it. And to set boundaries that aren't rigid, right? They're not rigid walls, but really they're flexible frameworks that kind of hold us together through each chapter. So if you're in a season that feels like it's unraveling, hear me when I say you don't have to lose yourself. Yes, your boundaries might need to shift. Yes, your vision may evolve. Yes, grief and transition may ask you to pause, to reassess, and lay low for a while. Lord knows I did, but that doesn't mean you're broken. Okay. Through all that, it just means you're becoming. Now, this is why I do the work that I do. I coach women just like you because I am you, a heart, high capacity woman who has to consciously choose herself every single day. I know it's hard to set a boundary when your nervous system is screaming, keep the peace. I know how disorienting it can feel to finally honor your truth and risk someone else's disappointment. But I also know how freeing it is when you do. That's why I created my LEAP method to really guide you from being stuck and self abandoning to being more sovereign and spiritually aligned. Because boundaries are not just something we do, okay? They're something we become. And it's through my lived experience and those lived experiences of my clients that we can kind of learn from that and grow together from that. So, whether you've been with me for a while or just stumbled across this episode, I want to invite you to do something courageous. I want you to come say hi. I want you to introduce yourself. I'd love to meet you. So, come on over to my Instagram at vicky.pittman.coach and or drop into my inbox and tell me who you are. What season of life are you in? What boundary are you currently holding or struggling to hold? What magic are you ready to reclaim? This is a space where your experience gets to matter. You don't get to go unseen or unheard here. You're allowed to be witnessed, and in very close, intimate ways or very open and shared ways. You get to decide. But I'll be right here cheering you on, holding, the torch, cheering for you, leading you away, reminding you that you are becoming more boundaried and returning to your sacred self every day. And if you've listened this far, I just want to just say a big thank you for holding space for me today, continuing to come with me on my journey and learning from it, holding space for me. And, it's my continued story, but it's also our continued story together from listener to host, coach, woman to woman. I'm so grateful for you. And so until we meet next time, love yourself like you mean it. I'm so grateful for you, and I can't wait to connect. Bye for now.